Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everybody and good morning. And welcome to the second of two webinars on using data-driven approach to making smart talent decisions for your organization. I'm Joanne Durr and I'm an executive coach, former HR executive. So I spent a lot of years in HR and a member of the Boston Club along with Stephanie Heider and Kate Kennedy, your hosts. So this series was created jointly by Kate and by Stephanie. And Kate is of USI Insurance Services. She did a webinar last week on using benchmarking to make smart decisions about your benefits suite, which was excellent and also available on recording if you're interested. And the goal is to help human resource leaders and talent leaders gain insight into two critical programs that we know are critical to attracting and retaining top talent, which is a robust, compelling suite of benefits and workplace flexibility. Very hot topic, especially since COVID, but even before then, as you'll hear from Stephanie. This goes way back. So both are passionate about this work and are very skilled, as you will see. Stephanie today will be sharing her experience and client success in using quantitative data to shape talent strategies in organizations. So we'd love for you to ask questions. You can do that one of two ways. We're a small group and we will kind of go around the room and do intros now and hear a little bit about what you're interested, particularly learning about. If you were to put a point on it on this particular topic, you could also pop a question into the chat. Kate's going to be monitoring the chat or use raise hands. So, we're recording for those who aren't able to participate today. And so you've read Stephanie's bio, so you have the background on Stephanie, but I'll probably have her do a little brief intro right now, as well as Kate. And then if we could go around the room and hear just a touch about who you are, what brings you to this webinar, and what particularly you're interested in learning. And for me, actually, I would say, I've been in HR, as I said, for many years and have been using audio and video technology for years and years and years because I worked in global companies. And it's just been fascinating to see the trajectory of knowledge exponentially grow, particularly since COVID. And now we really have to put a fine point on how to use the technology to help to enable us. But what I've never seen until Stephanie's work is really looking at a competency model for this work and benchmarking and best practices to help an organization really excel. So I'm always learning from Stephanie and happy to be here today and be moderating.
Thank
Stephanie?
you. So easiest way, I'll show this in a minute, but my name is Stephanie Heider. 27 years ago, I did my master's thesis on trust and global teams, and I nerded out about it, and haven't met a spreadsheet I didn't love, especially like with Orion and others, and so I'm really passionate about taking the nebulousness of human behavior and making it concrete. So looking at giving people concrete data, which I'll share that process and what we're doing. But I think it's just so important to be able to have some ability to quantify not only human behavior, but the ways in which organizations can structure things to enable those people to be successful. So
Nice, thank you. Kate.
Great. So just very briefly, I have been doing HR and benefits consulting for the past 25 years. And in my current role, I work with middle market companies to help manage and control primarily the cost of healthcare, and really looking to extract, the savings around the medical spend and bring value to that to help fund other initiatives, key talent initiatives, such as DEI and other initiatives such as remote work engagement and flexibility that we're talking about today. But one of the things I'm interested in, one is the cultural aspect of, with the hybrid workplace, those that continue to work in the office, bringing more sensitivity to shaping meetings to suit those who are participating remotely. It's a basic thing, but something that I've observed since I started working remotely back in the late 90s. So that's something that in particular is I think we still need to get better at today.
Great. Thank you. How about you, Jen?
Jen Morrissey. I've been, I guess, in some role of learning and development, organizational development, HR adjacent types of roles over the last 25 years, primarily in the manufacturing industry. And I think for me, one of the things that I find very touchy, I'm gonna use the word touchy, is in a manufacturing setting, there are people who have to be on site all of the time. And there are people who could potentially have the flexibility to work on site, off site in some type of a hybrid scenario. And how do I guess kind of close some of the stressors that might be associated with that?
I'm already chomping at the bit, Jen.
Pace yourself, Stephanie.
I know. I'll have a sip of coffee.
Okay.
Christy, would you be willing to come off mute and do an intro and what you're most interested in? Christy? Okay. Oh, she just
In the chat.
really, I'm having audio issues this
Audio
morning.
issues, yeah.
Sorry, Christy. Hopefully you can hear us. And thank you for being here. She can hear us. Okay, great.
Excellent.
Thank you. All right. And then and then we've got Denise.
Sure. Again, apologies for the voice.
No
I,
apologies needed.
yeah, I did want to be very much part of this, so I didn't want to miss it. I've been in HR for longer than I want to say. Right now I'm the VP of HR for a laboratory. And like Jen had expressed, we have a workforce that needs to be in every day. And since COVID, we have a workforce, a group that is hybrid. Since COVID has created, I think, some divide, trust issues or lack of trust between the two groups. And we always had a remote workforce across the country, sales and operations folks. So they haven't changed, but the dynamics between our laboratorians and the rest of the hybrid team has been a little bit challenging. We've done some pulse surveys, engagement surveys recently, trying to get some very specific feedback on what the issues might be. So I'm very interested in learning more about what you have to say, Stephanie, and what data we can potentially look at, because I'm trying to dig into our HCM system to work on some dashboarding and see what we can analyze, assess. So I'm looking forward to this. Again, apologies for the weak voice and the off screen.
No problem. Glad you're here. Christy, Kate's going to be monitoring chat. So if you want to pop in there what you'd like to most get out of the webinar or hear from Stephanie, and then as we go along, any questions, please do just use chat. All right. So Stephanie, I think you did your intro and we know what you're jazzed about. So I think we're ready for you to present.
Okay. And Orion is our program manager for Bridging Distance, so is
Right.
joining. She holds me accountable and keeps me doing what I need to do. So I wish I had met her 20 years ago. So, all right, I will share my screen and we'll get rolling. So just a little bit about kind of how we're gonna go today is do a little bit of an overview, which we did. Then we're going to start with a little bit of the future in terms of what we're seeing. And then we'll go over the hybrid workplace framework. I'll cover some outcomes and then we'll have discussion. But I don't want you to feel like you can't ask questions or chat or whatever you're looking for, because it's as we said, it's a small group, and I actually think that's kind of cool. So all right, just a little bit about who we are. As mentioned, you don't, we won't be quizzed on this, but it's a little bit of information about the depth of our experience and how we've always brought research into and evidence-based solutions that we validate and revalidate. So the Virtual Leader Workshop, for example, has been revalidated 6 times since 2001 when we introduced it. And then so we have lots of, data and all of those things, so we can make sure it's evidence-based. And then here's the second piece of it. So you see what was happening in the world, and then what we're doing. So this is, I'm going to date myself, and so Denise, I think you were sort of saying it too. When I talk about, I don't like the term remote because I think it connotes distance already. I really like the term teleworker, but nobody else uses that. But if you think about remote, it already sets up his and hers. And so Denise, for your issue around, the manufacturing versus people who can have flexibility, that tends to be something that we can dive into. But here we had our initial assessment, remote worker assessment, was called the telecommuter fitness. So that just tells you a little bit. And then most recently, we've been doing digital isolation and loneliness. And we did the first iteration of that research. We started it in July of 2019 and finished it March 5 of 2020. We replicated part 2 again in 2021 in Q2, and we're just launching it again. So we have pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and post-pandemic on isolation and loneliness. And I know that's going to impact so much of what we do. And I bring that up only because I think it's going to also impact our capability model, the competency model that we have. So, okay, so let's get started. What we're seeing now, a bit of an overview, is, I'm just going to move this, is flexible work is here to stay. So despite lots of mandates for everybody to come back in, we are seeing again and again and again that flexibility is really what people are looking for, and it's not going away. And I think in particular, one of the challenges and one of the reasons why this scorecard and this framework is so critical is because when flexibility is labeled as a benefit that only some people can have, it sets up a situation of have and have not. So I think the reason that I started with this one is because it becomes so important, the way in which those benefits are positioned. And so we can talk more about that because I know that there's some questions about it, but I think that when you're putting out a description and talking about what you're offering, if people can't and you have a have not, that just becomes a dangerous situation. So future leaders are requiring new skills. So we revalidated our virtual leader or hybrid leader assessment and updated our workshop with skills. So things like a higher need for empathy, an absolute need for transparency. And so just a couple of things. I have a slide on that later. AI is changing the pace of innovation. And so it's changing lots of different things, but relative, especially to the talent space and HR, the really innovation and the way they do that changes. Problem is that innovation, people are often, leaders are saying, well, we're bringing people in because they need to be in person to innovate. And that's actually not necessarily accurate. The biggest indicator of innovation, and we have a whole study on this as well, is the ability to take risks. So how psychological safety comes in here, and people's ability to not be punished for making mistakes. Because if you think about innovation, it's often because something went wrong. So, or because somebody took a risk. So there's that. Trust is paramount. And I could talk about trust all day because it was my master's thesis, and we isolated 2 types of trust and how they're different. So that's critical. Happy to talk about that separately. And then digital burnout is real. We just finished a project on research on digital fatigue and burnout. And one of the things that's really interesting is a major source of digital fatigue is blurred backgrounds. And so there's lots of reasons for it, but the blurred backgrounds are fatiguing, and I won't nerd out too much about this, but basically, there's a lack of differentiation when everybody has the same background, and it makes people tired because they don't have context clues to hold on to when they're in meetings. Because now I can see Joanne's bookshelf, or Orion's got the window there, and Kate, and that makes a difference in terms of being able to hook memory on something. And so that's just kind of small pieces of some of the things that we have found out. So in thinking about data-driven decision making for HR, there's a couple of factors, and these are higher level, particular because the passion right now is kind of return to office and mandate or not to mandate. So the first is thinking about the rationale for why, where people work and how they will work, or they are working. An example of this is, I know, so Zoom, the CHRO is a guy named Matthew Saxon. And so in working with them, they mandated that people who live within 50 miles of the corporate office need to come in at least a few days a week. And the other people could work fully remotely. And the reason is because they serve customers who are in hybrid environments, and so they need to be doing that. So when I was at Microsoft, we used to call it eating our own dog food. At Zoom, they say drinking our own champagne, which I prefer to dog food. But it's the ability to send. We have a living experience of the technology that we're creating and supporting for our customers. So that's an example of the rationale for why. Expectations. So what type of work occurs on site versus remote? And that goes back to that other piece around the differentiation of, what we're seeing around flexibility, and how do you define flexibility? And is there a way to offer different kind of flexibility for people who have to come on site? So those are the explorations of that, and at least talking about those expectations and setting them clear. And then tied to both of these is this idea of equity. And I talk about it as parity with a T and not a D, because it's actually not so funny. But it's not the same, but it has to be equitable. And so it's not going to be the same experience for people who are hybrid or fully remote or fully in person, but there has to be some continuity and consistency across that. So we are not feeding the have and have not monster. So then this, yeah.
Yeah, 1 second there. So Christy popped a question in there, and either you can address it now, because you're beginning to address it. She said, my 30-year career has been in professional services, and she recently transitioned into manufacturing, multiple locations. So could you talk about, and I think you're starting to queue it up, some corporate employees on site, some hybrid employees in multiple locations, and a non-English speaking population making decisions that impact all. So lots of different things going on, lots of dynamics. So how do you begin to increase, to use the strategy and the data and the strategy to increase maybe transparency and trust? I guess it's going to go there, but I don't know if you want to begin to talk about that now, or you think it'll be
yeah, I can give a couple of examples of things. So basically, you can start by saying, all right, so we have a pool of money for each person or for each department. And so sometimes we've had different flexibility options offered. So people who are hybrid, they can come in, and then so there's that piece. But people who have to come in all the time, maybe they have extra paid time off. Maybe there's a compensation or a pool of money to pay for gas mileage. Maybe there's extra childcare or healthcare or some other benefit. But if you can so you can think about the different kind of gauges that you'd have. One is financial. You can use your engagement data and some of the surveys that you've taken and had where people are feeding into those and ask them, what do they want? And so some companies, like technology companies, for example, have a lot better ability to have flexibility, and they would offer people, here's a pool of money, and you can choose. So it's a bit a la carte because they have that flexibility. And then so So there's that with English language speakers, or non-native speakers. Sometimes it's offering classes on site of English classes so that people can take a class on the lunch break or on their time. If you have some buffer in money, which I'm chuckling to myself when I say that, but to be able to have somebody come in on site and maybe 2 days a week, there's 2 different classes, 2 different ways of managing that. So again, being able to do that. In my town, Sterilite Corporation is just down the street. And they actually have a van that goes around to different geographies and picks up people and brings them to work and then drives them home again. So that's, again, there's different ways of managing that. There can be in-office perks. I think the days of pinball machine and pool and free beer are gone, but there's creative ways that people can do that, and sometimes it's also rearranging a break room or lots of others. So if you're curious, I am more than happy to have a conversation and delve into it further, and I can tell lots of ways. But again, it's that parity that becomes important. And Christy, feel free to put back into the chat if this wasn't helpful, or if there's anything else that we can talk about as we go through. So okay, so then again here, benchmarking data is going to guide your strategy, decisions, and actions. And so why is it important? So it's basically an accurate understanding of where you stand on recruitment, engagement, retention. And so what's the impact of that on productivity, on innovation, on error reduction, mistakes, some of the other aspects that you're going to be gold against. So it's important to have an evidence-based, accurate snapshot. And so, not to toot my own horn much, but over these years, I've seen many companies roll out something, and I would say, okay, so how do you know this? And they say, well, we just used our experience. Okay, but how do you validate that? And so the important piece is that it is validated and has a proven framework to it that has flexibility. And then in the process that you have the depth, so in terms of the competency model, you have the depth of 1 to 5, but you also have the breadth across the entire organization. And I'll show you that model in a little bit. But again, it's sort of validated. And then because we've been doing this for so long, we always ask the same questions when we do this with a client or on the research. We have the same standard, at least 5 questions. So we have comparative analytics across years of doing this, and we update it. Some of the language changes, frankly. So it used to be telework, and now it's remote, and it's sort of the same concept. But so again, having those comparative analytics, because we often see, senior leaders will say, well, our company is different from everybody else. And then you close the door and they say, okay, how do we compare? So it's like a secret tool. We're not supposed to talk about it. And you need that because of all this, you need to make sure that you have a trusted source. So that's a little bit about the why data benchmarking is critical. So I'm going to go over the framework of our model and try not to spend too much time on it because I want to get into some of the details of it. But in essence, we start with the center that we talk about mindsets and culture. And I think it was Denise who was, or Jen was talking about the culture and the impact of that. And here, when we talk about mindsets and culture, it's an established set of values, attitudes, standards, and the resulting behaviors that support hybrid work. And so we talk about the difference between the awareness and the habits. So senior leaders or people might be aware that flexible work is really important. There might be awareness of that. But do their habits reflect that? So do the habits in which they are engaging people Or are they using a proximity bias because they're going to the people who are closer? What do their behaviors look like? And are they a reflection of that awareness? The best I can think about is, okay, so if I'm traveling with a client and you know, I get home and I'm like, oh, I'm going out to dinner with some friends. I've been, you know, all these things, and I'm going to have, you know, a salad and a seltzer. And I get to the restaurant and all of my awareness is like, okay, I need to eat healthy, but they have my favorite wine. And then the special is a lobster mac and cheese. So what's the awareness of the right thing? And how do my habits reflect that? And we're not going to be 100% matched up for that, but it's really about being mindful of the connection between those. And then for the values, really understanding the culture values and how portable are those values, because they're going to drive decision making and across the organization. And if the values don't apply equally to somebody working from a home office in Houston, I have a business partner in Houston, as they do to somebody in Boston, then the decision making and the processes and then all of that is going to vary. And so you need to have clearly articulated cultural values, but then also have an understanding about how they may have to be adjusted, or how do you change some of the language of it so it reflects that ability to be the foundation. And so the reason that we have this model and that culture and mindsets are in the center is because everything else kind of goes around it and it provides the grounding for it. So we have technology here and we talk about supports and tools. And when people think hybrid, or even early in the pandemic, it was all about, okay, we need to buy laptops and we need to get Zoom. And that was the first part. And then, okay, now how are we going to support this? We don't have a help desk, or we don't have this. And so it's about that. And I'll share more about that in a few minutes. Then we have competencies. And so this is about possessing the necessary capabilities, and we separate it into skills and abilities. So we often say, hire for abilities and teach the skills. And when you can do that, so when you have a leadership ability, so this goes a little closer to aspects of things like emotional intelligence, or people have an ability to network with others, to form relationships. They understand the value of that. Maybe they don't have the specific skills about how to use technology to create presence and rapport with people, but we can teach those skills. But innately, if you talk about how hybrid success is about digitizing human relationships, and making sure that they're still accurate, then the separation of those skills and abilities becomes important. And then lastly is the structures. So these are the policies, processes, and procedures, both formal and informal. And I'll nerd out on the data for like 30 seconds on this, because 7 out of 8 of these subscales validated. Each time we redo this model, we do a revalidation and we do statistical analysis and use spreadsheets, and it makes me so happy. The only one that doesn't load is informal. And the reason for that is, if it's informal, that means there's pockets of success across the organization. Sometimes that's attributed to a particular location or a leader or some circumstances that enable it. And if it actually loaded, then it would be formal. So if it was statistically valid. So informal is one of the things that we have over the years really, really monitored in our framework, because if you have an informal success and you can formalize it, you have pockets of success. You know, your work is made up because you already have people who understand the culture. So that is our model. Here, I'm going to give you a quick, I won't go too much into our process, but in essence, here's what we do. We begin with this first look. So we interview people, we look at your engagement data. Our job as a customer service orientation is to make it as light a load on your people as possible. So you already have exit interview data, engagement data, probably Glassdoor data that we can look at, any other performance measures. We look at all that and we begin to code it. And so here's just a small snapshot, and you can see we start to put it into a little bit. So these are the subcategories of each of these models. Then we put it into some of the specifics of the structure here, and then start to code it. And you see we have a code book down there and all the themes. So that's how we can hold on to this and make a comparative. Technology, again, here we have that, and that's kind of easier because for technology, people are pretty good at managing that. So here's what ends up happening. Here's a visual of what you would get as an outcome. Here's we pick technology supports because it's simple. And here, level 1 for room setup or meeting tech support or help desk. Level 1 means that your company is not good at it. And then goes all the way up to level 5, where it's the gold standard. So what we do is, so the gold standard is that you're designing for remote. Your in-person rooms are designed for those who are not in the room, not for those who are in the room. So the setup is not what I call the tunnel view, and everybody's sitting around a long table, but instead it should be a curved where everybody's looking at the screen. There's no reason that somebody in person should look sideways, because then they're looking to somebody who's sitting next to them, and then they're and it makes the remote people feel less included. So here's the example then. The teal color here is where the organization is now. And this is just a small snapshot. We have 136 of these columns that break down into those 8 subscales, or these 8 categories. So here's where the organization is. And then we work with the leaders to say, okay, you can't be 5, you can't be gold standard on everything. Based on your strategy, based on the challenges, based on where you want to be, where do you need to be on each of these? And then that becomes the darker blue color. And so teal color is the current state, and the deeper blue is the desired state. And we work with that and then come up with a plan. But it gives you an overall example of what it looks like for each, and it's very concrete, and it is based on evidence and research and all kinds of things. So here's an example. This global technology company, 6 company locations in 6 countries, plus many home workers. Executive team was divided on mandating all to an office or allowing remote. The challenge is that they thrived on the connections in the office, but limited new hires wanting flexibility. So they were like, okay, so those hires, they were sort of non-people, right? So numerous people were doing things their own way. There were no shared expectations. There was no coordination. And really, there was a lack of visibility to the overall organization because they were so in-person focused. And one concept that we came up with, that we saw during the early parts of COVID, was that senior leaders really felt like they had better visibility into the organization because they could talk to people. You know, the funnel, I mean, the silos were broken down in some ways because they got to talk to people for 5 minutes on a Zoom call or something else. So it gave them visibility that they're wanting to repeat. So we have built-in structures to do that. So what happened? The overall strategy of the talent lifecycle that works just as well for remote as in person. And so again, we're going back to that concept of parity and sort of saying, how do we do that? That's also in terms of saying, what do you offer? Maintained hires in competitive market because of that flexibility, and it offered a broader pool that also goes towards anybody who's doing a DEI or DEIB initiatives. Offering flexibility also broadens that pool. Creation of a fully remote office space for higher productivity and engagement. So what we did was actually created the remote location nation, and they became their own P&L. They had their own budget. They had their own support staff, and they were the remote people. Methodology for how best practices are accomplish objectives, reduce meeting time with higher connections. So we have a line of business called Meetingitis. And so we implemented some of Meetingitis about when to use which technology, and a balance of synchronous and asynchronous, increased follow through on commitments with higher quality and accuracy. So that was just kind of one example.
Stephanie, I did want to just mention Jen was raising her hand.
Oh, sorry.
No,
no,
no, this is great. I'm super excited. But if you can go back to is that the same? So
Yeah, here.
and I'm actually, what I was reflecting on was the third bullet point on the top section.
Yep.
And one of the things I've observed, partly from, YouTube videos or TikToks or whatever's, and then also partly just from, I guess, experience in a company is, I guess the concept that new hires and very much, or even more so, I shouldn't say very much, but even more so, younger new hires, there's a tension between thinking or believing or observing that they need some of those connections and some of that structure and some of that in person opportunities to connect and to learn the job and whatever the case may be, along with a complete resistance to doing it because. And I just didn't know if you guys have had some insights into that as of yet.
So there's a couple things that I can say quickly, and then you and I can also talk offline.
Yep.
But there's this idea is there's, first of all, there are leadership skills that basically say, how do I create presence digitally?
Mhm.
So how do I make sure that the person who's working from home or working in EMEA or where else has the same presence and rapport with me digitally? And so sometimes that comes from having a budget for travel, so you can reallocate resources. And sometimes, so there's that piece to it, but then there's also this idea of being able to have, remote weeks, or, so there's a couple things in that. If you create the remote nation location and those people are all connected in the same P&L, you then have a budget and you can say, all right, so we're going to create, I call them pods. We used to call them cells, and then that got a terrorist connotation. So now we call them pods. And these pods are there within, 5 hours driving distance. And so people can meet and stay over at night, and they can work together. And so they can, and then that becomes these shared like mini cultures that are then still grounded on the culture. Does that help, Jen?
It really does. And it was just, we had a couple of experiences where, somebody new to the organization, just didn't get connected, or just the right connections weren't made, in terms of meeting people, establishing, who does what, and, connecting the face and the name and all that. And then again, kind of an overall and then, some level of there's a resistance to it and a need for it. And so how do you bridge that gap? So yes, that, like the things that you just kind of offered up, really helpful.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll catch up too. So again, here's another example. I won't go into it as much depth, but in essence, a mixture of manufacturing lab and office personnel plus some home office workers. The executive team was conflicted about paying real estate costs without the full space utilization. And so sometimes that's dependent on whether they're renting or owning. In this case, what they did was sublet a piece of their space out. Resentment from people mandated to be in office, labs, or plants. A lack of easy accountability and explicit agreements about how to work. So how do people connect with the remote folks? How do they feel connected? And how do the people who are in a plant, or they're in a lab, or wherever it is, how do they get connected with the folks who are designing or doing the drug protocols, or the designing, or whatever it is? Lack of easy accountability and explicit agreements, and then many leaders lacked the ability to create rapport. What we did was we basically looked at the talent life cycle that elevates and leverages hybrid, and so it's across the organization. So embedding aspects of the talent life cycle that aren't always the same, but there is parity across the whole life cycle. So so the EVP is similar. More retained hires due to defined, utilized onboarding and fresh and available tech support. So utilizing and onboarding, sometimes it means mandating that people for the first week, or, for the first 3 months, they come in you know, 1 week a month if they fly, whatever it is. Leaders networking and breaking silos enhanced by COVID and a lack of visibility. Physical meeting space designed for remote, we went over that. Robust, formalized micro and macro feedback loops. So it's not just personnel, it's also connecting, moving away from that hub and spoke leadership and communication where it's a center person, which is really a lot of what happened in early COVID. And then, but making sure people feel free to connect with each other in more of a spaghetti looking model. And then overall adoption of a more humble leadership style. We found that in post-COVID, that humility in leadership. Actually, one of our PhD interns did her Sci doctorate in that. So here,
Stephanie, sorry,
oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, another question that came up from Denise. Denise had asked, can you talk a little bit more about parity when you have a chance, assessing it and measuring it?
So, okay, so parity is, we begin by saying, okay, what are the available options? So let's go back with benefits. What are the available options? Do we have money? Where do we have some wiggle room around making different offerings? And so you think about it as, if you have a pitcher of water and you have to fill 5 glasses, but everybody wants a different beverage. Or a different color. How do you do that? So maybe you pour the 5 glasses, but then this group gets blue food coloring, and this group gets red food coloring. And there are a number of ways to do that. I think most of the resentment comes from how do you have people who are in manufacturing, who are really just at a machine, how do they interact and have opportunities to make the connections with other people? And so sometimes that connection really helps them feel like they're a part of something, you know, like the janitor at, you know, what was this, one of the shuttles or something, basically said, I'm helping to put somebody in space. He was the janitor. And so that sense across all of it. Does that help, Denise?
I'm sorry, I'm slow to unmute. Yes, it does.
Okay.
So parity, I'm thinking about what you just stated. Parity versus equity versus fairness. I'm just trying to play all that out because I've heard different employees state different things around fairness, especially like I think Jen said, she's got manufacturing people, we have lab people, and then we have the hybrid people since COVID. And we did do a couple things around benefits for the people who had to be in the building. Like give them a couple extra personal days and things like that. But how do you kind of differentiate between parity, equity, fairness, I guess is where I'm headed.
So we use parity only because so there is an overlap in equity and parity. So it doesn't have to be the same, but it has to be so that it can accommodate. And we did talk about it as equity. I kind of go back and forth on this because equity gets tied to DEIB or DEI initiatives. And so over the last couple of years, there's been more of a backlash against those kind of initiatives. And so we've moved to talking about parity. So you can think about equity and parity as the same. And the reason that I shy away from the word fairness is because that's much more subjective. Whereas if you talk about something that's parity and equity, it can be more objectives and it's easier. So when we do our work and on the scorecard with a client, we'd say, okay, so they'd say, well, this isn't fair. And okay, so tell me more. What does fair look like?
One thing, Stephanie, that strikes me as you're talking about the application of this concept of parity is that it's very much grounded in the business need. And so in and of itself, it has to have differentiation, right? And so there has to be, you know, different colors of the food coloring, right? Right. So there are different business needs, and, you know, So some of that just can't be changed.
Mm. And it's about, then, and then there's, if, that's a really great point, Kate, because then if there's transparency on it, that's really important. And we know that transparency and visibility, empathy have just catapulted in terms of the importance of both from the organizational structure perspective, but also what leaders are doing and saying and talking about. So I think that's a really great point, Kate, because it is about saying, we're not going to change the fact that we're a manufacturing company or we're in a lab and we're scientists or whatever it is. So we can't change that, but what we can do is have a conversation about, here's what the business needs, here's where we could be flexible. So, I mean, if you're a scientist, you're not going to be able to move the lab. So,
But talk about what those valuable contributions are of those individuals that do need to
Yes.
be in office, right?
Yep. How do they contribute to the whole? And often that lack of feeling connected, that lack of feeling like, I don't know if I'm important, happens a lot with remote folks, but we also see it in other industries. So I have a partner in Houston, did a lot of work in the energy business. And I did a lot of work between the let's say it's mostly guys. I was the only female on the rig when I was facilitating it. And then the engineers in the office who are designing things. And when we were able to put them together and have conversations about the value that they add and they bring to the business, it made a really big difference. So yeah, that's cool. All right, keep me honest, Kate. Okay, so here's just,
I think maybe, is this okay for this to be your last slide and then open it back up again? Because we should
yeah, that's fine.
end a little bit.
I won't talk too much about this, but basically, here's an example of, so where do you want to be, right? So, you know, we review with the leadership team, relating findings to the organizational strategy, and then we come up with, you know, where we can go. So, yes. So I'm going to stop sharing and,
So come back together again.
yes. Hi.
All right. So we talked about parity. I'm loving that you took the time to go into the language differences and the subtleties of parity, equity, and fairness, because as we know in HR, you know, the surveys and even the, you know, the Gallup research talks about fairness. So fairness is used, but it is subjective. So bringing it back to benchmarking and data, you can't throw that in people's faces, but to shift the language to parity, I think makes a lot of sense. So I'm glad you do that.
And even
let's-
equity, right? So.
Yeah. So let's go back to the questions. So I think there's a lot of questions about having the mixed environment. So maybe if you could just kind of wrap up with driving fairness, not even parity, driving a sense of transparency and security in the hybrid environment, which is becoming even more hybrid as we speak. Next version of hybrid is going to be on the horizon. Who knows what it is?
Well, I think the place to start is with the senior leadership around what our values are. So starting with the center of that model, with the mindsets, and how do our individual mindsets reflect that? And some of it too is the lack of transparency, because honestly, there are some leadership teams that we didn't have success with because their driving reason for mandating people to come back to the office was because they didn't want to pay, they were paying real estate costs. And they couldn't sell the business. They couldn't sell the real estate, and commercial real estate could be the next, you know, crisis. And so they weren't clear about that. So they were in that center model. There was a discrepancy between their mindset and then the awareness of what the right thing to do would be. And so, yeah, is that?
One question that I have that maybe just along these same lines, given your wealth of experience of developing and applying this model with, you know, several organizations over the years, can you talk about the correlation that you've seen between applying this model to organizations and their ability to do so successfully, and the tie between doing so and their business success? Because ultimately, you know, if a business is able to thrive and do better and be more profitable, then they have more, you know, to pour into those, you know, cups for everybody, right?
Yeah. So the biggest thing that I think about is the differentiator is when we have leaders who they're not trying to hide the fact that they're not knowing how to do this. They're coming from a place of curiosity, of wanting to learn and to do it better and to be candid with people. And so that transparency becomes important there. So if I'm curious about, what, some of the nuances of it, because it's our business, then I'm going to be even a little bit vulnerable. And be able to then say, hey, we're going to take a hit on profitability, depends on obviously how they're set up, who makes those choices, but we might take a hit profitability initially, but we're going to invest in this in the same way we would invest in a new truck or a new, a better technology. And so it's making the business case for investing in your people. And here's another little nuanced thing, Kate, that I find interesting. So we have found through our research and lots of experiences that people have different definitions of collaboration. So people say, I'm going to collaborate, and that means we're going to work together. So Joanne and Orion and I are going to collaborate. That means we're going to interact. That's my definition of collaboration. Other people think collaboration is the result. It's not the process, it's the result. We collaborated, and this is what happens. So when you have that very different definition of what collaboration is, you have people who are going to be at odds. And they're not intentionally going to be at odds, but it's the same thing around productivity. How are we defining productivity? And again, going to data to say, we are going to do this and we're going to invest in our people. So other questions? I know we're coming to the end of time.
Pretty
in the-
much it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to offer, I will put into the chat, or actually, Orion, if you could do that, put in the phone number and the website or LinkedIn to be able to connect with us. And I would offer also, I am more than happy to spend time with any of you who want to set up and ask specific questions. It's one of my favorite things to do. My favorite consulting is a day with Stephanie where we come in and set up virtual 30-minute sessions that are triage, and it's really a clinic or coaching, and much like we just did right now. So, and I do want to say thank you, and to my esteemed colleagues as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, for that. I've heard you many, many times, Stephanie, and I think because I have my HR hat, I found this one particularly illuminating and made so much sense. And I wish I was back inside so I could implement some of these things. So I hope it was helpful to all of you. Please get in touch with Stephanie. Orion is about to put her information into the chat so you can grab that. Thank you to Kate for co-creating this series, Orion for being here as well, and to all of you who participated today. Where can we find the replay? And where can we find the replay of Kate's?
We will be emailing out to all of the participants. Yeah.
Yep. So we'll have the two links to the different webinars. So this was fun. And again,
Okay.
feel free to ask questions because I can talk about this obviously all day.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kate. Have a good day,
Bye. Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Bye.